15 years ago in Fallujah, the person who saved 3 SEALs trapped under rubble didn't exist in official records. Classified operation, hidden identity, no trace left behind. But the boots remembered everything. Jessica Martinez relived that night every time she wore them. Waiting at the VA clinic, she heard the mocking voices around her. Fake veteran, stolen valor, until Mike Harrison saw the specific blood pattern on her boots, because that blood was his own. Welcome to Hidden Heroes. Before we continue this emotional story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being a part of it. The Veterans Affairs Medical Center in San Diego looked like every other government building. Sterile fluorescent lights, beige walls, and the persistent smell of industrial disinfectant that never quite masked the underlying odors of human suffering and bureaucratic indifference. The waiting room buzzed with the quiet conversations of men and women who had served their country and now found themselves navigating a system that seemed designed to wear them down through sheer attrition. Jessica Martinez sat in the corner, as she always did. At 42, she had perfected the art of occupying space without drawing attention. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore civilian clothes that had seen better days, faded jeans and a plain gray sweater that had been through too many wash cycles. But it was her boots that marked her as different from the other veterans in the waiting room. They were desert combat boots, tan leather cracked and scarred from use, the kind issued to soldiers deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. But these weren't the polished boots of weekend warriors or the barely worn footwear of those who had served in support roles far from combat. These boots told stories in their scuffs and stains, in the way the leather had molded to feet that had carried their owner through hell and back. The other veterans noticed the boots, of course. In a room full of people who had served, footwear was like a uniform. It told you everything you needed to know about someone's service. And Jessica's boots were raising eyebrows for all the wrong reasons. "Check out the wannabe," whispered a younger veteran to his companion, nodding toward Jessica. He was maybe 25, with the kind of fresh-faced appearance that suggested his service had been recent and relatively safe. "Those boots look like they've been through a blender." His friend, a stocky man with Marine Corps tattoos covering his forearms, snorted in agreement. "Probably bought them at a surplus store. You know how these stolen valor cases work. They get the gear to look authentic, but they never get the details right." Jessica heard them, of course. She always heard them. The whispers, the speculation, the assumptions. She had learned long ago that defending herself only made things worse. People believed what they wanted to believe, and the truth was often too complicated, too classified, too painful to share with strangers in a VA waiting room. She shifted in her plastic chair and looked down at the boots that had caused so much commentary over the years. The stains were what drew the most attention. Dark patches that had resisted every cleaning attempt, embedded so deeply in the leather that they had become part of the boots themselves. Most people assumed they were oil stains or mud or the general grime that accumulated on military equipment. They were wrong. The stains were blood. Not her blood, though she had contributed some over the years. The blood belonged to 3 Navy SEALs who had been trapped under the rubble of a collapsed building in Fallujah 15 years ago. Their blood had soaked through their uniforms, through their gear, and onto her boots as she dragged them one by one from the wreckage, working by feel in complete darkness while insurgent fighters swept the area with searchlights and automatic weapons fire. That operation didn't exist in any official records. The mission had been so classified that even the SEALs themselves hadn't known who had pulled them out until years later. The extraction team had been listed as unattributed assets in the after-action reports, and Jessica's role had been scrubbed from every database, every file, every piece of documentation that might have connected her to that night. She had been part of a program so secret that it had no official name. The operators called it Ghost Protocol, a unit of women specially trained for operations where male soldiers couldn't go, situations where their gender was an asset rather than a liability. They worked in the shadows, their existence known only to a handful of senior commanders who had the clearance to acknowledge that sometimes the mission required operators who could blend into populations where uniformed male soldiers stood out like neon signs. Jessica had been recruited straight out of basic training, identified by psychological profiles and performance metrics that marked her as someone who could handle the isolation, the secrecy, and the moral complexity of operating in the gray areas where conventional military rules didn't apply. For 3 years, she had been deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan on missions that never happened, saving lives that were never at risk, stopping threats that never existed in official reports. The Fallujah operation had been her last. Not because she had been wounded, though she carried scars from that night. Not because she had failed, though the mission had gone sideways in ways that still woke her up in cold sweats. She had been pulled out because someone in the chain of command had decided that Ghost Protocol was too risky, too expensive, too difficult to maintain in an era where congressional oversight and media scrutiny made secret programs harder to hide. The women of Ghost Protocol had been given new identities, new backgrounds, new lives that had no connection to their classified service. Jessica Martinez became a former logistics specialist who had served 2 tours in Iraq in a support role. Her real service record, the missions, the commendations, the blood and sacrifice, had been sealed in files so classified that they might as well have been fiction. But she had kept the boots. It was a violation of protocol, she knew. She should have turned in all her gear, accepted the cover story, and moved on with her civilian life. But the boots had been with her through everything. They had carried her through missions where one wrong step meant death, where the difference between success and failure was measured in heartbeats and split-second decisions. They were the only proof she had that her service had meant something, that the sacrifices had been real. So she wore them to every VA appointment, every medical exam, every meeting with counselors who tried to help her process trauma they couldn't know the full extent of. The boots were her armor and her burden, her connection to a past she couldn't talk about and an identity she couldn't claim. The waiting room had filled up since she arrived. More veterans, more stories, more broken pieces of lives disrupted by service to a country that seemed to have forgotten them the moment they took off their uniforms. Jessica had been coming here for 5 years, and she recognized most of the faces. There was Carlos, who had lost both legs to an IED in Afghanistan and spent his days fighting the VA for a wheelchair that actually worked. There was Maria, who had been sexually assaulted by her commanding officer and was still waiting for someone in authority to believe her story. There was David, whose PTSD was so severe that he couldn't hold a job, but whose disability rating wasn't high enough to qualify for the benefits he needed. They were all heroes in their own way, Jessica knew. They had all served, all sacrificed, all earned the right to be here. But they looked at her boots and saw something that didn't add up. A woman claiming service she hadn't earned, displaying scars she hadn't suffered, wearing boots that told stories she hadn't lived. If only they knew. The door to the waiting room opened, and a new arrival caught Jessica's attention. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of bearing that marked him immediately as military. But it wasn't just his posture that gave him away. It was the way he moved, the constant scanning of the room, the automatic assessment of exits and potential threats. Jessica recognized the signs because she had spent years perfecting the same habits. The man was Mike Harrison, though Jessica didn't know his name yet. What she could see, even from across the room, were the subtle indicators that marked him as special operations. The precise haircut that was just regulation enough to pass inspection, but short enough for operational requirements. The watch that was expensive enough to suggest disposable income, but not flashy enough to draw attention. The small scar above his left eyebrow that spoke of close encounters with violence. Mike found a seat near the magazines and began the ritual that every veteran knew. The careful study of everyone else in the room, the silent assessment of who belonged and who might be trouble. His eyes swept past Jessica once, then came back to her boots. At first, it was just casual interest. Combat boots were common enough in Virginia waiting rooms, but something about the pattern of wear, the specific way the leather had been scarred, made him look more closely. The stains caught his attention next, dark patches that looked almost like... Mike's breath caught in his throat. He knew those stains. Not all of them, but the specific pattern on the left boot, near the toe. He had seen that exact stain form 15 years ago in a collapsed building in Fallujah, when his own blood had dripped from a shrapnel wound onto the boots of someone dragging him through rubble in complete darkness. The memory hit him like a physical blow. The weight of concrete on his chest, the taste of dust and cordite in his mouth, the certain knowledge that he was going to die in that collapsed building. Then, hands in the darkness, a voice telling him to stay quiet, to trust her, to hold on. Those hands had pulled him free, then gone back for his teammates, making 3 trips through insurgent fire to save men who had been written off as casualties. He had never seen her face. The operation had been during a power outage, and by the time rescue teams with lights had reached them, their mysterious savior was gone. The official report had credited the rescue to friendly forces in the area, but Mike and his surviving teammates had spent years trying to identify the woman who had risked everything to save them. Now, 15 years later, she was sitting 30 feet away in a VA waiting room, wearing the same boots that had been soaked with his blood. Mike stood up slowly, his legs unsteady. Around him, the waiting room continued its normal rhythm. Veterans checking in for appointments, nurses calling names, the general background hum of institutional life. But for Mike, everything had narrowed to the woman in the corner and the boots that had haunted his dreams for 15 years. He walked across the room, each step feeling like it took forever. Other veterans glanced up at him, sensing something in his movement that suggested purpose, intensity. Jessica noticed him coming, but didn't react beyond a slight tensing of her shoulders. She was used to confrontations about her boots, used to angry accusations from people who thought she was disrespecting their service. Mike stopped in front of her chair and stood silently for a moment, studying her face. She was older than he had imagined, mid-40s, with lines around her eyes that spoke of stress and sleepless nights. But there was something in her bearing, a stillness that he recognized from other operators who had learned to be dangerous while appearing ordinary. "Excuse me," Mike said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Could I ask you about your boots?" Jessica looked up at him, her expression carefully neutral. She had fielded this question hundreds of times over the years, and she had her standard responses ready. But something in Mike's tone was different. This wasn't the angry challenge she usually heard, or the skeptical inquiry of someone looking to catch her in a lie. This was something else entirely. "What about them?" she replied, her voice equally quiet. Mike knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level. The movement drew attention from other veterans in the waiting room, who sensed that something significant was happening, but couldn't quite identify what. "The stain on the left boot," Mike said, pointing to a dark patch near the toe. "That looks like blood." "It is blood," Jessica replied simply. "Whose blood?" Jessica studied Mike's face more carefully. Now that he was closer, she could see details that confirmed her initial assessment. The tan lines from gear that had protected him in desert environments. The slight tremor in his hands that suggested old nerve damage. The way he held his left shoulder, protecting an injury that had never quite healed right. "I think you already know," she said. Mike's eyes widened. "Fallujah, November 15th, 2008. Building collapse on Route, Michigan. 3 SEALs trapped," Jessica continued. "No conventional extraction possible due to enemy presence and structural instability." "You were the one," Mike breathed. "You pulled us out." The waiting room had gone quiet around them, other veterans sensing that they were witnessing something important. Jessica looked around at the faces staring at them, at the same people who had been mocking her boots minutes earlier. "I was never there," she said quietly. "Officially." Mike understood. He had spent enough years in special operations to know how classified programs worked, how certain operations simply disappeared from official records. But he also knew that the woman sitting in front of him had saved his life and the lives of 2 of his teammates, and that she had spent 15 years carrying that secret while enduring the suspicion and mockery of people who had no idea what she had sacrificed. "Staff Sergeant Chen didn't make it," Mike said, referring to one of the SEALs who had been trapped with him. "I know," Jessica replied. "I carried him out anyway." Mike's throat tightened. Chen had died 2 days later from his injuries, but Jessica had risked everything to give him that chance. She had crawled through collapsing rubble under enemy fire to reach men she didn't know, for a mission that would never be acknowledged, for reasons that went beyond duty or honor into something more fundamental about who she was as a person. "Ma'am," Mike said, his voice formal now, carrying the weight of 15 years of gratitude. "I owe you my life." Jessica shook her head. "You don't owe me anything. I was doing my job." "No," Mike said firmly. "Your job was whatever they told you it was. Saving us was something more than that." He stood up, came to attention, and rendered a perfect military salute. The waiting room erupted in murmurs as other veterans recognized what they were seeing. This wasn't stolen valor or fake service. This was recognition between warriors, acknowledgement of a debt that could never be repaid. Jessica looked up at Mike for a long moment, then slowly stood and returned his salute. It was the first time in 15 years that anyone had saluted her for her real service, for the missions that mattered, for the blood on her boots. "At ease, petty officer," she said quietly, using his old rank without having to ask. Mike lowered his salute but remained at attention. "With your permission, ma'am, I'd like to make some calls. There are people who need to know you're alive, people who have been trying to find you for 15 years. Jessica considered this. For 15 years, she had lived with the secret of her service, unable to claim credit for her sacrifices, unable to seek help for injuries sustained in operations that officially never happened. The boots had been her only connection to that past, her only proof that it had mattered. "I'm not supposed to talk about it," she said. "Things change," Mike replied. "Classifications get downgraded, programs get declassified, and sometimes the right people in the right positions can make things happen that should have happened years ago." He pulled out his phone and showed her the contact list. Names that Jessica recognized: senior officers, Pentagon officials, people with the authority to acknowledge what had been hidden for so long. "The three of us who made it out," Mike continued, "we all stayed in touch. We've all wondered about the angel who pulled us from that building. Let me make some calls. Let me see if we can finally give you the recognition you deserve." Jessica looked down at her boots, at the stains that had marked her as a fraud in the eyes of people who didn't know the truth. For 15 years, she had carried the weight of unacknowledged service, the burden of sacrifices that couldn't be shared. The boots had been her only witness, her only proof. "Okay," she said quietly. "Make your calls." 2 hours later, the waiting room of the San Diego 5A had been transformed. Word had spread through the veteran community with the speed that only military networks could achieve. Former SEALs, Special Operations veterans, and senior officers who had served in Iraq during the classified operations period had arrived to meet the woman whose existence they had long suspected but never been able to prove. Jessica found herself surrounded by men who had spent years in special operations, people who understood the weight of classified service and the cost of operations that could never be acknowledged. They looked at her boots with new understanding, seeing not stolen valor, but evidence of sacrifice that went beyond what most people could comprehend. Mike had made his calls, and the response had been immediate. Within hours, preliminary authorization had been granted to begin the process of limited declassification of Jessica's service record. It would take months, maybe years, to fully acknowledge her contributions, but the process had begun. As the day wound down and the crowd began to disperse, Mike approached Jessica one more time. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything. For that night, for carrying Chen, for keeping the secret all these years, for showing us what real service looks like." Jessica looked around the waiting room, at the faces of veterans who now looked at her with respect instead of suspicion. The boots that had marked her as an outsider were now symbols of something deeper, proof that heroism often wore ordinary clothes and carried extraordinary burdens in silence. "Thank you for seeing the truth," she replied, "for remembering." As she walked out of the VA that day, Jessica's boots seemed to carry her differently. The stains were still there, the scars still visible, but now they told a story that could finally be heard, carried weight that could finally be acknowledged. After 15 years of silence, the boots could finally speak. Sometimes heroes hide in plain sight, wearing the evidence of their service on their feet, carrying the proof of their sacrifice in places where others see only imperfection. Sometimes the blood on old boots tells stories that classification can't erase, and sometimes the right person in the right place at the right time can finally give truth the voice it deserves. This story was brought to you by Hidden Heroes. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever judged someone based on appearance, only to discover you were completely wrong? Tell us in the comments about a time when your assumptions were challenged. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.